Let's see if I can get this whole thing going. Um, Sorry, sharing screens is weirdly difficult. Um,
You're
awesome.
up.
Cool. Amazing. Um, yeah. So today, super excited to be here. Kind of what I'd like to start off this talk with is a throwback to the 1960s, where Marshall McLuhan published his seminal text, "The Medium is the Message." And in it, funny enough, there was a typo in the title itself during the publishing of it. And so the title was "The Medium is the Massage," but he decided to keep it because he thought that that in itself sort of fit with the thesis and the ethos of what he is trying to produce in talking about the developing media in the coming world, the sort of globalization and the developing of technology. And it kind of also is, if you take it sort of literally, it's like massage, but also it could fit into this idea of like mass age and thinking about the distribution of services. And essentially, if you're familiar with it, you probably know the basis, but kind of the gist of it is that he was focused on how whether although the content of certain texts and existence are important, something that arguably is even more important is the character and form of it. Because if you view for example, the example that he liked to look at was if you looked at a movie or some of those texts that are in visual form, that kind of changes when you view it on a website. And that idea is really striking. I think a lot of current web designers, interface designers, and people who think about this are constantly coming back to this text and thinking about it as one of the sort of biggest texts in considering the digital age. And I also think that him keeping that um, text change in his title feels very poetic in itself, because I think that one of the things about poetry and notes of poetry is that there's these individual things that make you feel sort of like important or significant, or those one lines that make you think about these things. And I think that while a lot of people don't have formal definitions of poetry, that is definitely one of the considerations. Kind of following to this, one of the things that I'm also personally obsessed about and thinking about is this specific spread from a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which I think was published in the late 2000s, early 20. But in this book, which you can kind of see, I think that comics kind of serves as this direct medium where, almost in response to Marshall McLuhan's piece about how do we consider the medium of print in this sort of like animated form, where if you've ever read a comic or a graphic novel or, like read that sort of deal, you would know that time moves kind of different and non-linearly, and we're able to create these senses of worlds and world building within it, where you can create motion, you can create sort of these various elements. And I think that in itself is really exciting. So a little bit about me. I'm Ivan. I am excited about a lot of things, but I make websites, animation, comics, games type. That's kind of like the list of things. I'm also very excited about poetry. I read a lot of poetry. By day, I make websites. By night, I make worse websites, is kind of like what I like to pitch myself as. And I think that one of the things in the consideration for those is that all of these things think about different mediums as a form of communicating stories. Um, I think that they are in itself creating different worlds, different lives, different existences that people are considering. At the end of the day, that all these things that we're doing and creating are about telling storyhoods of different people's lives. And so that is primarily my interest. Um, Specifically, I think I kind of wanted to bring this working definition of what computational poetics, and like the rest of this talk will obviously try to like go through definitions. I think is more, I ended up more survey, but this, I think, beautiful paragraph from Catherine Wu, who's a programmer and literary artist in Providence, Rhode Island, discusses computational poetics as this idea of thinking around digital text, data, code, and also the programmer as a designer, the programmer as graphic designer, the programmer as creator, and the designer as creator. And in what ways do we create text on the screen to convey new information, new aesthetics, and new cultures? I also would love to talk about this kind of dichotomy by um, created by one of my friends. Her name is Kevin Yang. She pointed this out very notably in her programming language work on Comb, which I'll go into a little later, in that generative art is interested predominantly in the results created by generative processes, and poetry makes nothing happen um, by audit. And I think this idea is very stark in the two of how do we reconcile this dialectic between something that is generated so focused on processes and programs and interest in the computational sense and feels very functional, and something that is in itself not functional. And I think that people think a lot of poetry is not useful. And specifically, I think hopefully by the end of this, this beautiful quote by Mary Ruefle, which talks about the discussion and creation of poetry as if you're working on something, that you should never be sort of very well focused on it, that there's so many trials and tribulations. And I want to argue that if you have any idea for a program that you start, there also is a very similar process. And so, kind of starting through this beginning, I like to think about the building blocks of kind of like code and poetry to begin with, which is focused solely on the words and letter forms that appear on the page. And so, when we consider typography, which I think is very sort of like an underwhelming slash not considered discipline, one of the things that I think about significantly is what languages are we even thinking about to begin with? By default, I think a lot of programmers are program in English. That's where the most like packages are completed. That's where most resources can be found. But there are a lot of scripts that exist in the world and have various different forms on the page, especially when we come to the beginning in the history of sort of computing and using monospace fonts as a default. We had at the beginning of the sort of like technological age of CRT, cathode ray tube televisions, where that in itself was the creation of why we have these sort of like block defined monospace fonts, because of the way that the electron tubes were vibrating in the television. They're able to give us these sort of graphics slash rasterized pixels on a screen, which were able to allow for boxes and shapes that were very well defined. And this was obviously inspired a lot through the retro age. One of my favorite typographers, his name is Toshio Magari. He's a Japanese typographer that's really interested in arcade typography. This is from his book, focuses a lot on this pixel definition of how robust and interesting the development of typography was to give such visual character. And I think that that is honestly one of the considerations that is sort of left out in code editors. When you think about it, obviously we default for monospace because of the readability, but I'm personally just interested in like, yeah, people always put like scripts or other things, just exactly like, what do we think? What do we look like? And for the formal definition of, we can see here, like monospace has mono width across every character as compared to portional width, which creates significantly different visual rhythm, visual acuity, visual purposes. And I think that in it from poetry, the consideration of what the letters themselves feel as a sort of visual diagram is significant. I'd also like to put up, this is called the E-cubes slash cube from a typographer and theorist named Garrett Norzage, who wrote a book called The Theory of the Stroke. And one of the things that I think most interestingly in the study of typography is the amount of technical knowledge and this idea of interpolation. And so if you look at this cube, you can see that the three dimensions result in sort of, if you view each vertex as a potential point of a font weight or font definition, you can get all of these different sort of interpolated points in between. And one font that does this fantastically is a recent typeface by Aerotype called Recursive. I'm not sure if people are familiar, but it's a monospace casual sign painted font that was inspired by this process. And here you can kind of see those visual definitions where it ranges from monospace to more casual. It ranges in weight. And also, I think is just a beautiful representation of how we can build intuitive 3D models in the browser. Um, yeah, just super, super cool to look with. You can play with this on the site. Another thing in that consideration in going back to the creation of type itself is thinking about the keyboard existence and keyboard mappings that we use that I think we take for granted. This is a project by Jörg Puringer called Unicode, where he put together a video and poster of uploading every Unicode character available in existence, which I think was upwards of 60,000, and printed this all on this massive sheet. And I think what is super striking about this is thinking about the considerations of scripts that exist in the world, the fact that we exist in a Unicode consortium that approves and disapproves what is being and allowed to type. Many typographers or individuals who work on non-Latin scripts, non-familiar scripts, more things that are folk and indigenous, feel that they struggle against this sort of like consortium of individuals because they appeal to the masses. And so in this consideration, what does it mean for an individual to be able to type and communicate across languages? And what happens when technology, otherwise known as language, fails us? And how can we communicate that? Specifically, this is a list from the Unicode Consortium on the list of scripts that are currently in consideration. While most of them are older or archaic, I think this highlights a significance of whether or not we as humans are able to communicate through across different scripts of language. This is a great poster from one of my friends who works as a Cherokee type designer, and I think highlights the sort of presentation or biases that we have as individuals towards looking at Latin scripts, especially in programming. Kind of tying into that and focusing on that, one of the things that I think is really striking in the programming world in consideration for how we think about it in poetic nature is this idea of keywords. A lot of the code poems and work that I've specifically investigated is thinking about how these keywords are used. What does it mean for a keyword in existence? I think this really beautiful definition taken from the Mozilla site of just like if a const in JavaScript describes a block scope local variable. This in its definition is very technical, but I wonder whether or not we can think about things that are changed through reassignment. What does it mean for a variable to be constantly reassigned? What does it mean for a variable to be updated, removed, recreated, redefined? I think this other thing about technical documentation is also really interesting in this other thing about creating UI assets. I think this in itself is so lovely and feels very poetic of someone from the Mozilla team probably just drew this on a piece of paper, scanned it, and was talking about sketching your design. Related to that, here's a Stack Overflow post that was thinking about, in addition to things that are constant variables, what does the word let mean? And some of the illustrations and references, I think, in history focus on the idea of let coming from mathematical proofs and mathematical understandings. There is this level of grammatical supposition of how do we consider this word in existence. And I think that this feels really, really beautiful in itself. One other project and a couple of other projects that I like to highlight in thinking around typography and the languages of computing is this programming language called Wenyan Lang, developed by a PhD student in China who is focusing on creating a archaic and prehistoric Chinese script in thinking about what are the syntax, languages, and creations that we can bake. How do we feel programming feel like we're reading old Chinese text? And so here we have the left-hand side, a built-in interactive code editor on the web, where on the left we have the Chinese definitions and creations, and on the right is the sort of compiled into JavaScript and what that looks like. I think that's so significant in the creation of how do we make these worlds and how do we make programming more ubiquitous across other languages. Specifically in thinking about this and the idea of Unicode, another programming language, APL, had this idea of monadic functions. And I think of this in the sort of like programming functional sense, but also I think that because it was such a symbol-driven language, all of these Unicode points must have existed for this. And I wonder whether or not this could be of interest in creation of other scripts, other Unicodes. What is their relevance and existence? Another, in the role of computing, I'm also really interested in this idea of kind of lower level / computing through hand. And this is a constructed language known as conlang, but specifically a subset of this known as artlang. And so a constructed language is one in which people or individuals work on a language. Klingon is a very good example, but through any process of creating linguistic, phonetic, syntactic definitions. And this is called Sevhu, which is a koi fish style language, where depending on the linguistic nature of the sound that you're making, you create these beautiful koi fish paintings almost of words and phrases and repetitions. And in this process of encoding and decoding what that means in a visual nature, we're able to create some beautiful visual art. This is another programming language called Cooklang, kind of a neighbor to Chef, which focuses on a markdown style language that provides individuals and users a way to create recipes, documentation for them to build out all of their recipes. And I think that in these creation of those keywords, this kind of syntactic nature, these visual highlights give new meaning to what those ingredients are. I also really just love this example from a book called If Kerouac Wrote JavaScript. Richard Feynman, the entire article was a list of sort of people who he was like hypothetically thinking, what if they wrote JavaScript? And I just think this feels very fun and very practical. I also think that this example sort of highlights the nature of commenting as individualistic style, individualistic voice, something that is sort of seen as like a practical usage and or useless or adds additional visual lines. What does commenting mean in the programming world? What does that mean for creating individual programmer voice? Um, in creation of poetic nature themselves, I think one of the definitions is thinking about and being a poet is sitting with words themselves and sitting with sentences themselves, always in consideration of what they mean, how much meaning they have, can they have new meaning, do they have meaning at all? I think that is sort of the waxing nature of it in questioning all of these ideas. This piece from Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. Brian Eno is a experimental musician, but created this thing called oblique strategies, which was used during a period of figuring out what are ways that we can constrain our problem solving space and how can we make these things more interesting through a programmatic approach. I'd also love to highlight, these are a couple of poems by a professor at ITP named Alison Parrish, who's a poet, computational researcher. There's this idea in poetry called concrete poetry specifically, which feels very much on the edges of graphic design, programming, generative art, but the focus on it is the visual quality of the poems themselves and how they're arranged in a way. And so these are a couple of pieces from her work called Compass, where she takes four distinct points in four different directions and threads and interpolates them into new meanings in the between, bringing back that idea of sort of interpolation, what exists in between the binary of two objects and what new meaning can we generate from that. Here's another poem called Diagram. Specifically, the top text is a visual nature of a scene that is like theoretical, and the bottom is the poem itself. And so in it, the user is asked to compute those systems to thread and bring together this world and this meaning. And the poet asks the user and the viewer what they're able to get from creating this spatial difference. Here's another visual during the Futurist period by a poet and typographer slash graphic designer named Marinetti. In it, he posed a lot of visual ideas about what the coming of an on future world where technology is ripe everywhere and we have distributed technologies everywhere. A lot of this type is really strong, really bold, has a lot of visual and sonic noise. We think about it in this kind of creation of worlds and how I think similar to other worlds of globalization, such as Namjoon considering what this kind of dissonance on the internet looks like. Here's another piece by his which has this phrase "zang tum tum," which in it is the sort of voice and sound of it creates this kind of sonic quality around thinking of the ways that we are saying these words have visual meaning in it. Here's another concrete poem called Topspin. In it, we can see this phrase topspin being repeated around an axis. I think that there's almost a kind of animated quality. Look at the quality of the S on this character, the way it bleeds into the page. Um, I think that that has so much texture and almost brings a level of animation to a otherwise static image. And kind of lastly, on this idea of computational poetics, um, as a game maker and a game lover, one of the things that I'm really drawn to is this game called Celeste, where you as a character and as an individual are climbing up this mountain, dealing with your own anxieties, struggles, and feelings of overcoming. In it, while you're climbing up this mountain, the game making and game playing is actually extremely difficult, and many players will play in the game, will struggle, die to random spikes, and have to try over and over again, keeping up these trials and tribulations. There's this idea in game development posited in 2007, um, specifically on BioShock Infinite, of this idea of ludonarrative harmony and ludonarrative dissonance. Ludo, meaning play, narrative, obviously talking about story, is where gameplay and story work to create a meaningful and immersive experience. From a design implementation perspective, it is the synchronized interactions between in-game actions, mechanics, and in-world context. Another game that does this so well is a game called The Witness by Jonathan Blow, who's also a programmer, designer, artist. In it, you are exploring an unknown island, solving puzzles to unwrap the mysteries of the world. Another game um, made by web artists is called The Marriage, in which two blocks are dealing with various struggles of other various colors. These in itself feel very concrete poetry to me in consideration of the visual qualities and the color choices used on the page to create meaning. This other work called Ame by Seiichi Nekuni is a visual concrete poetry piece where these colons and dots represent the rain, and the bottom character, which is Yu in both Yu in Chinese or Ame in Japanese, represents the water character. But one of the significance of this is that it transcends language. Um, you don't need to know that the character at the bottom means water. You're able to represent and see the visual acuity of the page. Here's a piece that I had created a while ago for Taper Magazine called um, with a same focus on this idea. The top character means sky, the middle character is obviously the falling water, and the bottom character represents the ground below. Here's another piece by Alita Sun, um, creating those sort of ASCII images. I think what's extremely striking to me in this is that those ASCII images typically use monospace fonts in consideration for the fact that they have a mono width for every element. But what does that look like if every element is not mono width? How can we create this? And also, how do we use data in order to block and prevent new meaning? This piece specifically was focused on recreating and redefining how AI work. Um, AI and AI reading can overtake and absorb our data in ways that we can block this. And so, in coming back to this idea of generative art and computation interested in the processes and functionality of it, and poetry having no meaning, I think that this idea of ludonarrative dissonance and ludonarrative harmony is the fundamental existence for combinational poetics. In it, we're investigating in new ways, such as constraints in our design space. How can we create that and invent new ways to understand ourselves by providing things that stand in strong juxtaposition? Are there ways that poems have new meaning, that programs have new meaning, and what they do in between? Additionally, in what ways do programming mechanics assign deeper meanings of individual words? And how do keywords and these lives and focuses that we create bring new individual meaning in redefinition, reassignment, and recreation? A great author and programmer, Robin Sloan, wrote out in this newsletter about an app called Boop Snoop. In this app and piece, he says an app can be a home cooked meal. He created an app specifically for his family, and they use it every day. And I think that in itself feels very sort of in this ethos of how do we create something that feels personal? How do we create something that has very deep meaning? and something that is not bound to the restrictions of growth and scale. There's another seminal piece by Brett Vector where he talks about digital art and the creation, and he says to stop drawing dead fish. And so I would like to tell you to stop writing boring programs and experiment and create things that may be meaningful and might work. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Ivan. I'm going to make you full screen. Does anyone have questions or comments for Ivan? You're standing between us and lunch. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Please go get lunch.
I'm actually going to get him to come up here.
I was wondering if you're familiar with the artist Ram LZ, specifically his work, A Treatise on Gothic Futurism, and like his short film Alpha's Bet.
Do you mind repeating the last part? It sort of got cut out in I think in the mic quality.
Sure. I was wondering if you're familiar with the artist Ram LZ, specifically his work, A Treatise on Gothic Futurism, and his short film Alpha's Bet.
Oh, I'm not actually. Um, would love, yeah, like would love to hear a little more, like what is specific about it.
He was a late 70s hip hop and street art pioneer, and he was fascinated with the idea that the shape of letters contained meaning in itself, and that they were he had this sort of mythology about letters being controlled by the tyranny of the alphabet. So that's what the short film Alphabet is about, and the treatise on Gothic futurism is sort of supporting his theory with his research into monastic illustration and Japanese calligraphy.
Amazing. Well, we'll make sure to get those references shared out to everyone. Any other questions or comments for Ivan? Ivan, we will let you go. You can see my face, I think, a little bit. Thank you so much. That was lovely. I think we got the recording. We will see you in the Discord. We'll see you afterwards. Thank you so much for taking the time to come in and beaming in from Seattle.